Hi, my name is Dorian, and this is You, Me, and the Industry, a podcast where I get to hang out with people from the games industry and talk with them about their job, the industry, and a bunch of other stuff. On this episode, I'm joined by Richard Lemarchand, who is an industry veteran with over 30 years of experience under his belt. Richard has worked on multiple titles of the Uncharted as well as the Legacy of Kain series, and has recently released an outstanding book that details the process and challenges of making a video game called A Playful Production Process. We discussed the making of his book, what it was really like to work with industry legends, how a new generation of video game makers are tackling game design, and much more. Furthermore, we discussed the hero's journey, how Richard felt watching the Uncharted movie, and I get to ask about the essential snacks he's missing out on since he moved to the US. Please enjoy. Everyone, and welcome to the show. Today I have the great pleasure to talk to Richard Lemarchand. He is an industry veteran with over 30 years of experience. Throughout his career, he was the former lead game designer on Uncharted 1, 2, and 3 by Naughty Dog, and also worked on the Legacy of Kain franchise over at Crystal Dynamics. Nowadays, you can find him being a professor at the USC Games program and author of the book A Playful Production Process, a book that goes into detail of what it takes to create video games. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Dorian. It's a real pleasure to be with you today.
How are you doing these days?
I'm doing all right, thanks. Yeah, we're at the very end of the spring semester in the USC Games program. I am dotting the I's and crossing the T's on my final grading for my 2 classes that I've taught this semester, and looking forward to a bit of a break over the summer.
Nice. That sounds awesome. I have plenty of questions related to your time being a professor, of course.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into it with you.
Right, yeah. And as courtesy out here in the podcasting world with me at You, Me, and the Industry, I always let the guests bring a topic to the show. And you actually have 2 topics for us to talk about. And, I always love kicking off the show like that. And let's start with the first one. Like, you mentioned the books by Octavia Butler.
Yeah. So, I think Octavia Butler, who was an American science fiction author, I think that she's quite well known as an author nowadays. She's associated with the Afrofuturism movement, which is a movement in science fiction, envisaging different and better futures for Black people.
Okay.
And I started reading her. I came really late to her work. I only started reading her about 6 years ago when I read her book Kindred, which is one of her most famous books. Kindred's an incredible book about a character who is actually a writer, an American writer, who is plucked back in time to from California to Maryland during the time of slavery. And
okay.
It's an incredible novel. I don't want to say too much more about it, but it's a novel that is very relevant, I think, to the current historical moment in the United States and around the world. But I think I just always loved to evangelize Octavia Butler because, she had quite a long career. She died, sadly, much too young, and wrote many different styles. And I just, for people who love science fiction and kind of speculative fiction, I love to recommend her because, she wrote this incredible 2-book series, The Parable of the Sower and The Parable of the Talents, which are kind of near-future dystopias set in a world where the president of the United States has the slogan, "Make America Great Again." And remember, these books were written in the 90s, so that's a little...
Sounds very much like fiction to me.
Right. She wrote this incredible series called the Patternist series.
Right,
kind of about psychics. That was a 5-book series. I think my favorites are the Xenogenesis series, otherwise known as Lilith's Brood, which is about aliens in a organic spaceship who have come to Earth after a nuclear war and plucked up some of the surviving humans and begin to make genetic modifications on them. And it's an incredible book. It's one of those books that makes you think about so many different topics, from sociology to psychology to the life sciences. And it's just a really incredible piece of drama as well. So yeah, I always want to urge people to look beyond the most famous Octavia Butler books.
Yeah.
She's become my favorite author, I think, of all time in the last 5 years. So yeah, I really love to evangelize her. Have you ever read any of her books, Dorian?
No, I was just about to mention that, me being here in Germany, it's always a little bit, I guess, very, from a culture-wise, very different compared to the States, because, well, we are, of course, sort of like subjected to topics about, like the Jews and what we did in World War II and stuff. But I guess compared to the US, we are much less likely exposed to topics like slavery in the sense, because our history is like rooted differently than yours. So I guess there's like sometimes less frequently the books are making it over in our like conscious mind, I guess, or in our like some of the books we used to read. But on the other hand, I also read like 1984, like very famous American written novels. So I guess there are chances that it's here.
British George Orwell was a.
Oh right, I'm sorry. Of course, George Orwell.
Yeah. Which is where I grew up. I've lived in the United States for half my adult life now, and became a citizen, about a decade ago.
Yeah.
Which means I feel like I have more of a right to comment on things now that I have a vote. But no, I think all of us who are embroiled in the legacy of colonialism.
Right. Yeah.
It's good for us to look at these intersecting topics, of our positionalities around ethnicity and gender and orientation and class, right? And
yeah, totally.
And I think always the best science fiction authors, and I didn't come up with this, I'm stealing this from the science fiction author William Gibson, the best science fiction authors are always actually writing about the present day. They're philosophers, right? Looking at what it means to be a person in society and as an individual. And I feel like, very much that's what Octavia Butler was doing. She's one of my favorite thinkers. It's clear to me she was a real philosopher. So yeah, check out her work. Yeah.
For sure. I will definitely look into that. And you just mentioned it, like commenting on the present. I think my uncle told me this. He grew up with Star Trek, and I think this was also a very big topic, that they have like intercultural people on the crew, basically like a Russian with a Chinese, and like all the like different ethnicities here. So there was also commenting on like the issues there. I think it was I'm not quite sure if I'm correct, but like maybe during the Cold War times, where they had like very difficult issues with like Russia and like. Funnily enough, now too, I guess. But always back then, still commenting on like present day issues, was also like also was having like a black officer on the Uhura, like on the crew.
Gene Roddenberry and the crew that created Star Trek famously had this kind of utopian vision for their science fiction universe. And it's much debated about the degree of success they had, but certainly there were many things about the series that were super progressive for the time. So awesome, I guess. And from a book that sort of influences you and touches on many different things and makes you think, I guess it's a perfect segue to talking about your book, which I was also like reading, and also funny enough, maybe it's a little segue here also there, because I recently purchased The Playdate by Panic, I think, and I was still tinkering about like maybe starting something into game development, because I never did. But I was reading the book, and I was thinking first, it will be a quick read, just like not skimming through, but it will be easily digestible. But I found myself stopping at every chapter, thinking like, very interesting. And I think especially one chapter, like one thing you mentioned, totally blew my mind. And like as you see with the podcast, I do quite a lot of interviews with people, and I think I'm quite well versed with some things in the games industry. But the one thing that blew my mind was the mentioning of sound in prototypes or in like demos, because I always thought about demos or like
like prototypes that you just showcase a sort of feature, like maybe an inventory or like a sort of gameplay loop. But I never imagined that, of course, the sound feedback you get, like the feedback that provides something, will give you like changes everything. And I think I would have never thought about it if it wasn't for your book, especially this early on. I think it's very interesting.
I'm really glad to hear about that, Dorian. And you're not alone, in sort of looking past or maybe hearing past sound.
Right.
The crucially important role that sound plays in the way that video games work. I think I say in the book, out of sight, out of mind. I think that's why we have a tendency to forget about it. But it's so crucial. When I was at Crystal Dynamics, somebody said to me, and I wish I could remember who, that the eye is connected to the brain, but the ear is connected to the heart. And I think that what they were saying is that, the information that we receive visually, while it can have some emotional impact on us, of course, doesn't do nearly as much to shape our moment-to-moment emotional experience as the audio does. And, if you've ever seen the Scary Mary, which is a trailer for Mary Poppins recut with terrifying audio.
Yeah, right.
The audio can completely recontextualize something. I'm also very interested in what Steve Swink describes in his great book, Game Feel. This is a book I'd strongly recommend to you, Dorian, if you've never checked it out.
Sure.
Game Feel is all about that elusive, hard to describe feeling that you get when you're playing a video game through the control scheme. It's also affected by the animation and also the audio. So it's like the difference in the feel of the jumps that Sonic the Hedgehog and Mario, right? Those are quite different game feels. Or it's like the sort of the tightness of the steering in Forza as compared to the kind of more rubbery looseness of the steering in Mario Kart or something. Right. And audio just plays a massive role in that. When you slam a big hammer down on the floor, the sound of that impact.
Right.
Can communicate information to you, whether the floor is made of earth or wood or metal, the impact sound of that hammer will tell you that. So audio in games is huge. And every semester I have to struggle to get my students to put audio in those few prototypes that they made. But when they do, I think that's when the magic really starts to happen.
Right. Yeah. And like I said, like this would be a perfect segue for like the second topic you brought to the show is like the scheduling and the creation of the book, which I think is very interesting because I guess I heard all but praise from everyone I follow in the games industry talking about your book, and like as far as I can tell for myself, it's a great book and I recommend everyone to check it out.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, I'm feeling a little regretful now that I proposed this as a topic. It's a bit much for 20 past 9 in the morning where I am, and maybe at the beginning of the podcast. So I'll try and keep it brief.
Sure.
One of my missions in writing the book was to help game developers with a problem that nearly every game developer I know, including myself, struggles with. And in fact, I think that most creative people struggle with. And this is the problem of running out of time at the end of a project, because of course, when you conceive of a project, you think of it in a certain kind of size and scale. This is what game developers call scope. Software developers generally call it scope. And, it's very easy to get locked into a plan that is just too big compared to the amount of time that you have given yourself to develop it. And this leads directly to the thorny problem of crunch, which is this problem of unsustainable, uncontrolled overwork, where we end up working late into the night, sometimes all night, working weekends, working 7 days a week for weeks or months, or sometimes even years on end,
Yeah, right.
One of the biggest blights on the game industry, something that, has been more discussed over the last 10 years. And I think that in certain places we're starting to get a better grip on it. But when I became a game professor, I was like, right, I've got to see what I can do to help my students bring their projects under better control. And so that's a big part of the motivation for the book and the process described in the book. So I had this lurking fear that in the course of writing the book, I was going to end up crunching.
Right. Okay.
I started writing it when I was on sabbatical. So I had some time off, and I wrote it over a couple of, the summer breaks that we get from teaching. But of course, I had to be writing it while I was also teaching. So, when I said I wanted to talk about scheduling the writing of a book, if there's anyone out there who is setting out to write a book, I recommend embracing the same kind of spirit that I talk about in the book for making game software, where you try and stand something up quickly. You kind of get something going. We start playtesting the games that we're making in my classes in the very first week, and then we playtest them every single week. So the sooner you can get something up on its feet, the better. I've learned from my colleagues in the School of Cinematic Arts at the University of Southern California, where I teach, that screenwriters call the very first draft of a screenplay that they write, they call it the vomit draft. And the idea is to sit down at the keyboard and, like the I don't know what I'm doing Labrador, you just kind of bash it out,
Right, yeah.
And I didn't even call this the first draft of my book. I said, this is the 0th draft, right?
Yeah, right.
And so I bashed it out quickly, and then I went back to the beginning and I started rereading it and rewriting it. And then that gave me my first draft. And then I went back again and I edited it much more rigorously this time. In fact, to do this, I stole another tip from my friend Jack Epps Jr., who is a screenwriter known for the original Top Gun movie, actually.
Oh, wow.
And Jack told me that when you're really working on a piece of writing, no matter what it is, if you get to a certain stage, print it out and sit down with a red pen and read it through. And Jack says that your eye traverses the printed page differently than it does the screen. And I was skeptical about this at first, but oh my word, what a difference it made. I have a funny way of constructing my sentences. I have a tendency to kind of back into them.
Okay.
Making them harder to read. And so I found when I printed it out, I could see these kinds of problems and really easily fix them. And then, of course, go back to the word processor. I think I did 3.5 drafts in the end.
Okay.
In this way. My very last draft was really just a polish pass. So the other really nerdy thing that I did was I had a word limit that had been given to me by my publisher. And again, this was kind of to do with the scope of my book, right?
Yeah.
So I just used a spreadsheet, every game designer's favorite kind of document, to track how long each chapter that I wrote was in words. And when it came to these rewriting passes, that really let me know what percentage I needed to cut of each chapter. Anyway, this is a very nerdy digression, but I hope it might be useful to anyone out there who's thinking of writing. And I definitely recommend it. I had a real blast writing my book. It was really enjoyable. So I hope these comments might be useful to anyone contemplating writing.
Yeah, I mean, I only I can provide feedback right now, and I think it's very interesting, to be honest, especially the part of the printing. But in your book, you talk quite a lot about playtesting. So was there any sort of let's call it playtesting involved with the book? Have you ever handed out the book, scripts or drafts of it, and said can you read it? And it's I think this is too slow, or I need some a little bit tighter here in the areas.
So actually, yes. I before I started writing, I listened to the audiobook of Stephen King's book that he wrote.
On Writing, I think. Is it that called?
On Writing, yeah. Is the name. On Writing, A Memoir of the Craft.
Right, yeah.
Title. And it's really great. I liked it so much, I actually listened to it twice through in a row. I immediately went back to the beginning. And he talks about having, I think he calls them expert readers, or maybe he calls them something similar, like trusted readers. People who are close to him, who share his taste and understand his writing style, that he gives out drafts to. And I actually did this with a few close friends. And it was really helpful. I was incredibly grateful to them, because to read a book of this length through is a big investment of time. So I'm very grateful to Tracy Fullerton and Mark Cerny, both of whom read it through and gave me notes, as well as a number of other friends who read sort of bits and pieces of it, chapters here and there. So I think that's a really good thing to do, Dorian.
That's awesome.
It's a little bit like game designers, who are often very reluctant to show their work to other people.
Right.
because they know that it isn't ready, that they know that it isn't right or good yet. But I think we really have to get over that. That's where the trusted readers thing comes.
I guess it's always everything. It's at the beginning quite embarrassing that you're like, it's not at the level of quality I would prefer. I guess the same with my podcast. You know, in the first episodes, I just sort of like released it and hoped for the best. And then I think one of the YouTubers I followed, I think his name is Maximilian Dude. He once said like, everything you will do, like, no matter how much time you put into it, it will always be terrible. It will always suck in the beginning. And even though you could have spent 30 years of putting it out, after 1 year, you will look back into it and say, like, that was terrible. That was just bad. And then nowadays, you will just like I said, the prototyping, like the honing your craft just by doing it will make you better. And I guess this is the lesson learned here. Just, you know, if you're too afraid of releasing something, do it. And then you will feel better, much better afterwards if you sort of keep going at it.
It's a real challenge, you know, for people who are really into creativity and making things. A lot of us are perfectionists, you know.
Sure, yeah.
And perfectionism can be a real enemy. You know, they say perfection is the enemy of the good. Holds us up in so many ways. There's this great quote by Ira Glass, who's an American journalist and writer and radio personality, known over here for a show on the National Public Radio called This American Life. And he talked about this thing called the gap. And I actually quote him in my book. He says that we get into being creative because we have good taste. But the problem, especially early in our careers, is that the things that we make can never, ever live up to excellent things that we love, you know, because we got good taste. And he says the only way to get through it is to just keep making work. You just have to keep putting stuff out there, and you get a little bit better and a little bit better. When I look back, you know, on my early game design work, I feel very much the same. But, you know, we get a little bit better each time. We get there in the end.
Right. And, you know, it's sort of something like what you're currently doing as a professor. So what I found very interesting is you've been a professor for over 10 years now. So have you noticed a change in design approach by young people over the years?
That's a really interesting question. I think that I have, yeah. In actual fact, I think that maybe this week was my 10-year anniversary in the USC Games program. I started teaching in August of 2012. So, and I think in those 10 years, I have seen an evolution in as much as I think that young people come to take the 4 main degrees that we offer, as well as all the minor degrees that we offer, better prepared now. And I think that, you know, this is just because they've grown up in a culture pervaded by digital games and, of course, physical games, board games and card games and other kinds of game-like entertainments, whether that's escape rooms or interactive theater. They've also grown up around computers and cell phones, and maybe, you know, they had some early exposure to coding, at least some kind of visual coding. I have found that early, 10 years ago, it was a little more likely that people either fell on the technology side or the sort of art and design side, with a smaller number of people who are like Renaissance people, who like to do both things. But today I find that, you know, the proportion, the ratio is the other way around. Now it's the majority of our students are both inclined towards technology and art. And as such, since I don't really like to lump design in with the art side of things, actually, because I think design actually unites and unifies the sort of the left brain, technological, mathematical, scientific aspects of game development with the right brain, creative, emotional, sort of artistic ways of thinking. I think design is always about finding balance between all of the elements at play, whether we're designing a video game or a chair or a jetliner, you know. As far as their tastes go, I mean, this is one of the wonderful things I think about being a game designer, whether in industry or academia. Game design is such a big tent with so many different genres and styles and audiences for our games. And so it's like everyone is into different stuff, and it just creates this incredibly rich mix of people who are into action games and narrative games and strategy games, puzzle games, games for education, and other kinds of serious games. And that's something that I really, really love about my job, because no two student projects are ever the same.
Okay, interesting, yeah. And over the years, you've taught game designers like Abby Sherlock or Catherine Yu, who created Heirloom, or Jenny Zhao Shu, who is creating Consume Me. So, like, what is it like to see games and the creators you supported throughout their time at USC to find successes on their own in the games industry?
I didn't work with Jenny. She was actually a student at NYU, but I put one of her amazing physical prototype images in my book. But yeah, I actually saw Catherine Yu and Abby Sherlock last night. Their game Heirloom is fantastic. They actually made it originally in my class, which is the class based on my book. And it's first-person narrative game about family history. I strongly recommend that people get it and download it. They're actually both just graduating from our MFA program. So looking at their thesis projects, which are also very creative, which you can find information about out there on the web. What was the question, Dorian?
No problem. The question was like, what does it make you feel like finding their own, like once they release something to the public, that they find their own successes, that they sort of get like, recognition, like maybe YouTube views or follows or stuff. After you have taught them everything and sort of like, or like taught them stuff, and then they sort of realize it and release it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's almost a cliche about how satisfying teaching is, but I'm here to tell you that it's absolutely true. That feeling of working with someone, as they take their next steps, in learning the craft about whatever kind of game design they're interested in, it's just phenomenally satisfying. It's always really great, no matter, whether people are sort of at the very beginning of learning games, to see them kind of light up as they begin to understand the way that the systems that game designers create sort of are interacted with by players who kind of bring those systems to life through their interactions, and have emotional and intellectual and sometimes physical bodily experiences as well, as a result of playing with these artifacts, these play evoking artifacts.
Right.
Seeing people kind of come alive to those possibilities is really satisfying, as well as, with the incredibly talented MFA cohort whose games I'm going to look at today at their thesis shows, who are kind of at the other end of the arc of their education. It's a fantastic feeling. People often ask me, do I miss working in AAA? And of course I do, because that work, some of the highlights of my life, the reception that Uncharted 2 and Uncharted 3 got, was a similar kind of incredible satisfaction, seeing people enjoying something that you've made. But I often feel like, I'm the executive producer on 16 original game projects a year. And I always keep an arm's length distance from my students' creativity, at least in terms of the way that they express themselves. I try to rarely, as I can, intervene in that, because I do see video games as an art form, and I don't really think it's my role to push my students to become this or that kind of an artist. I have my own biases that I wouldn't want to inflict on them. I do get into their business when it comes to matters of craft, right? When it comes to, I see them trying to do something, and because of the play tests, we can see that it's not quite working, and I might, give them an idea to try this or that thing. And hopefully that's helpful. But I think it's the degree to which I do participate, which is satisfying to me, is giving them this structure of the 4 production phases I talk about in the book.
Right, yeah.
And seeing them being able to reliably make something great by the end of the 15 weeks they spend working on these games. And that gives me really great satisfaction.
That's awesome, yeah. And that brings me to a different topic. So back in the day, game development degrees were sort of laughed at. So like, what has changed over the years?
Well, I mean, I don't know that the way that the industry looked sideways at game education was ever really that warranted, to be honest. I think
Mhm.
that having spent, a long time in industry, I just think there's a bit of that old human tendency towards not invented here. Game designers of my generation, we were kind of self-taught and we were taught by our peers. I think that games academia always brought a lot to the table, both in terms of the concrete training, in like the hard
Mhm.
skills of game development, but also in terms of the design thinking and the critical thinking that games academia was bringing to games. I think if the industry had been a little less resistant to games academia,
Right.
then the game industry would have progressed, certainly
Mhm.
culturally, a lot quicker than it did.
Sure.
We were stuck in the old-fashioned mode of games with limited genres, limited kinds of game mechanics for a decade longer than we that we could have been,
Mhm.
until the kind of the revolution that happened with indie games, and AAA companies making stranger, innovative games like Katamari Damacy and
Right.
stuff like that. But I think that over time, of course, people just realized the good stuff that game programs had to offer
Mhm.
in terms of people who were well educated in those hard skills, and also in terms of perhaps the soft skills that we've always had a big focus on in the USC Games
Sure.
program.
Mhm.
Partly because half of our program is situated in the USC School of Cinematic Arts, which is the second oldest film school in the world. And for a long time, the School of Cinematic Arts has had an emphasis on the idea that it's not just the hard skills that are important in filmmaking, it's the ability to get along with others and to communicate clearly and to resolve
Mhm.
conflicts well. And so that was something that, thanks in part to the founders of our program, like my good friend, Professor Tracy Fullerton, we've had a big emphasis on in the USC Games program as well, because it,
Mhm.
is clearly borne out by my experience in industry. It's not enough to be a good game developer. You've got to be oriented to the team if you're going to make something really, really
Right.
excellent.
Mhm.
So yeah, of course, teaching game development is really hard precisely because game development and game design is such a big tent. There's so much to learn about all those different tools and all of the coding that goes into a game, and all of the art and animation discipline that goes into it, and just how hard it is to be a good designer.
Yeah, totally.
Integrate all these elements into something that really, really works. It's taken some time to figure out how to do it. But
Mhm.
I do think now there are so many great game programs around the world that it's accepted by industry now, that
Sure. Mhm.
the great value that they have.
Right. Yeah. And speaking of teachings, at yeah, like some things you teach during your courses. So, is dressing up like a plant and needing to learn how to use a sewing machine something that you need to learn as a game developer?
So, listeners, Dorian is talking about a game that I made with my colleague Marzi Campos, Professor Marzi Campos, who also teaches in the USC Games program, who's actually a graduate of our MFA program. And Marzi had won a scholarship that meant that she had to work with me for a year. And we made this game called The Meadow, and you can find a bit of documentation about it online. And Marzi studied at RISD, so her background is in the arts. It's the Rhode Island School of Design, where Talking Heads famously went to school, and or at least some of them did. And Marzi loves to use fabric and other kinds of physical materials in her work. I am very interested in virtual reality. And so we
Mhm.
kind of, and Marzi is also very interested in experience design and immersive entertainment, the kind of stuff of Disney Imagineering, the people who design the Disney theme parks. So we kind of fused our powers to create an experience that started out in the real world. You went into into this kind of open-sided tent, which we decorated inside to look like a little forest glade. As if you were in a bower with trees above you and rocks made of fabric and pads of moss and grass made of fabric underneath you. And this character that Marzi designed, a boulder with a face that you would actually re-encounter a little later on in the virtual reality part of the experience. And we always saw this physical installation as a kind of a gateway or a portal into the virtual world. So you'd be invited in by people dressed, as you say, in these kind of green druidic robes, and settled down. And we had scripts that we followed to say certain things to people to get them ready to then go into the virtual world, where they have this short kind of 5-minute interactive musical experience, where they were now in a virtual version of the Meadow. And I was always very pleased with myself to say that the sewing machine, which we bought to use on the project, was one of my favorite pieces of game development equipment. Thanks for bringing it up, Dorian. That project was a lot of fun. Enjoyed it a lot. And Marzi is a supremely talented game designer. She's gone on to make a whole sequence of indie games, many of which are award-winning. And she's just done incredible work. Check out the game Klaxo Radio Hour. You can find some good documentation on Marzi, which is martzi.com. You see a load of her amazing work there. Klaxo Radio Hour is a game that you play by tuning in an old-fashioned radio in the different radio stations.
Awesome, yeah. I will also have likely linked to everything you just mentioned, as I'm quite thorough with my linking excellent. And stuff. So it's always in the show notes. So in case people want to look up, want to check out something, it's always in the show notes. And like I mentioned, it has been quite a while since you were part of Naughty Dog, and since then, another sequel released, Uncharted 4, Uncharted Lost Legacy released, and also recently an Uncharted movie. So, what does it make you feel like looking at these things? I mean, some of them are still being worked on by your colleagues, for example, Neil Druckmann. What does it make you feel like? Do you see still the DNA ingrained you even put there in the first place, or do you see it's a great evolution, a great direction they took it? And also maybe can you still feel the DNA through something like the movie, which tends to be not being any harsh that I haven't seen the movie, but tends to be more on a little bit of a roller coastery ride and less maybe of an artistic side. Not saying anything.
Well, I mean, of course, I have a lot of opinions about everything that you just mentioned. I think, my simple answer is a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. I definitely sort of see the fingerprints of the folks I work with and myself on everything that's happened since then, including in The Last of Us, because of course, The Last of Us games are very different from the Uncharted games, but I think that each game series that Naughty Dog made was kind of an evolution of the last. I think there are more similarities between Uncharted and Jak and Daxter than people realize. And there are more similarities between Jak and Daxter and Crash Bandicoot than people realize. Soon after I joined Naughty Dog, someone said, Crash is actually really a narrative game. And even though it wasn't story heavy, they pointed out to me that there's a famous, there's kind of special levels in Crash Bandicoot where Crash is running towards the screen, being chased by a giant boulder or sometimes a dinosaur, kind of Indiana Jones style. Part of the thinking around those levels was that you could see Crash Bandicoot's face. And of course, we tune into human emotion through facial expression in large part. So the panic on his face as he runs away from this kind of looming danger, there's a storytelling technique. And of course, the Jak games had a lot more story. And then the Uncharted games kind of evolved the storytelling approach as well. I'm a big fan of the Last of Us games. I think that they're really incredible. There's so much going on in those games. And so, yeah, it's a nice feeling to have been a part of the history, that led to these amazing places. I'm also a fan of, the more recent Uncharted games. And I am a fan of the movie.
Oh, really? Okay.
The movie is really great. I went to see it with a big group of friends. We actually hired out a small movie theater up in Birmingham. You can do that over here.
Awesome.
And took a big bunch of us. And while the movie, is kind of quite distinct from the world of the games, obviously, like the casting is quite different.
Sure, yeah.
The essential spirit of the movie is very much in keeping with the spirit of the games. It does have these, great roller coaster action sequences. And that was always part of the philosophy of Uncharted. We were trying to make fully playable versions of the kind of incredible popcorn munching blockbuster movies that we grew up watching in the 80s. But they're really funny. It's really funny, the Uncharted movie. And it has a lot of heart as well, with incredible actors like Tom Holland and his co-stars. I think that always a part of what appealed to people about Uncharted was the genuine human emotion that's to be found amid all the explosions and the witty one-liners, thanks to Amy Hennig, who, of course, is the game director of the first Uncharted, the creative director on Uncharted 2 and Uncharted 3, and everyone who collaborated with Amy around the storytelling in the game, and the design aspects, the game design aspects that support the emotion in the game.
Right.
I think that, that stuff is an essential part of Uncharted, the heart, the sort of the touching emotion, even if you like the life lessons that can be found in the Uncharted games, because every one of the Uncharted games has like a theme or kind of a moral in the end.
Yeah, right.
It says something about the human condition, whether it's like the greed, which is discussed in the very first Uncharted game, or questions around friendship and loyalty and trust and betrayal, which are the major themes of Uncharted 2 among thieves. You can find that stuff in the Uncharted movie as well. And I'm really glad to see what a big success the Uncharted movie has been. It was a surprise box office smash over here. It's just popped up on my Apple TV on streaming on demand. And I'm already looking forward to seeing it again.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned it on Twitter. I think, what's the issue with the hero's journey? I think you mentioned, it's colonialist and patriarchal. So is this still the case? And are there any games that sort of oppose that trope?
Well, to be clear, I'm a fan of the hero's journey, the hero's quest. It's this set of ideas that come down to us from Carl Gustav Jung through Joseph Campbell. It's the idea that these, psychologists and anthropologists originated, that there are kind of patterns of archetypes, these characters that we see repeat over and over again in different cultures around the world that seem to be built into us as a part of being human. And Joseph Campbell identified a thing that he called the monomyth, a kind of underlying pattern of story that he saw in the mythological traditions from many cultures around the world, and then which were brought to Hollywood in part by a guy called Christopher Vogler, who wrote a book called The Writer's Journey. That laid out a good pattern for a 100-minute, 120-minute screenplay about a hero who is reluctant at first, but who is called onto an adventure, who goes kind of out into the world, either literally or sometimes metaphorically, kind of going away from the world that he's familiar with, to ostensibly retrieve some magic artifact that's going to heal whatever problems in the world. But really, it's about a journey of self-exploration and personal growth, right? Overcoming the obstacles within us that are holding us back from becoming the kinds of people who we could be. And, Amy Hennig introduced me to The Writer's Journey, the book originally. It really expanded my understanding of how stories work. And we now think about this in terms of story structure. And the thing that you're referring to that I posted on Twitter is actually a short article that I wrote for the MIT Press Reader, which is an online journal. They were kind enough to invite me to write a little bit about game design and storytelling. But, I mean, I'm someone who likes to think critically. And I do think that the idea of the hero's quest emerges from a certain moment in European history. I am concerned that it elevates things like acts of individualism over acts taken by communities. Mm-hmm. Which, begins to give us a sense that maybe there's some kind of political problem at work here.
Right.
And, taken against the context of the problem of colonialism that we were mentioning earlier in the podcast, of, these largely, but not always, European nations, at least post-Enlightenment, who sort of colonized other parts of the world and extracted their resources and brought them back to their home countries, doing tremendous damage to the places that they colonized as part of the process. Mm-hmm. I think we have to be reflective about the relationship between identifying something as a universal pattern and then, the historical context within which it's located. And to think critically about that, because this is just how we make progress, right?
Yeah, right.
We should throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's many wonderful things about the hero's quest, but I think if we do think critically and hold ourselves accountable for the problems of history that have kind of been onboarded with certain ways of thinking, then we have an opportunity to create better futures, right? Futures which maybe heal some of these old hurts and that make sure that we don't make the same kinds of mistakes going forward. That's why I'm interested in other kinds of story structure now, things like sequence structure, which I talk a little bit about in my book, which was proposed by a guy called Frank Daniel, who's a former dean of the USC School of Cinematic Arts. And he says that, you, in the same way that you can break a story down into 3 acts or sometimes 5 acts, kind of 3 or 5 shorter stories, you can break the acts down into sequences. Mm-hmm. And so in this way, stories are kind of fractal. We look at one big story and then we can see multiple smaller stories within it and multiple smaller still stories within that. Mm-hmm. This is a way that whether you're a storyteller working in film or writing a novel, or whether you're a game designer, even a little bit interested in narrative, you can start to wrangle the narrative elements of your game by breaking it down into these smaller chunks, each of which have a beginning that set up the initial circumstances,
right.
A middle, usually where the fun stuff happens, the conflicts, the battles, the emotional relationships, and then an end, even if it's only a temporary end. People often ask me, as someone who worked on, these kinds of games that had, a main fairly linear story arc, how we can deal with issues around story and narrative, either in very long-running game series or in open world games and in MMOs. And I think the answer to those interesting questions lies in looking at this kind of fractal nature of story and thinking about things in digestible chunks or sequences. There's a lot of fun stuff there to talk about.
That's awesome, yeah. And maybe you can help me out here. So in a previous episode, I discussed with the former concept artist of Naughty Dog, Alex Nioneki, that to me, the many big set piece moments in games like Uncharted or The Last of Us, for example, the big airplane sequence in Uncharted 3 it was, I think, and all those big showcase moments that they want to sell the game on the trailer. But I think they sort of in the end, to me, don't make the game. And I think they only work because you have this sort of more smaller, more intimate, quieter moments that make them real, the real memorable takeaways to me. So can you maybe, since you're quite eloquent, can you maybe explain this theory in a more sort of based on game theory way, or is it just sort of me being crazy?
No, Dorian, I think you're really onto something important here. And this is actually something that I teach in my classes. It's a really essential part of what I teach in my classes. It's really about contrast.
Right.
I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Spinal Tap. There's a bit in there where the lead guitarist of this, mythical heavy metal band is explaining that that their amps can go up to 11 because when they're playing really loud at 10 and they need a bit more extra power, they can turn it up to 11. Right? And obviously, the lesson there is that things can't just be really loud all the time. They can't just be really intense all the time because we get numbed out to them. We get kind of inured to them. I don't know if you know the alternative rock band, the Pixies, but there's a documentary about the Pixies, which is called Loud, Quiet, Loud, which tells us everything we need to know about the structure of a Pixies song, right? Which starts out really intense, but then suddenly drops into something very quiet and spacious. And it's this contrast between intensity and something else, something peaceful or thoughtful or reflective, which I think makes these kinds of things really work. My go-to example in the Uncharted games is always from Uncharted 2 Among Thieves, where I think it was Amy and Neil Druckmann and Bruce Straley who came up with the idea that what if after one of the big explosive action set pieces in the game, we had a short sequence of gameplay where we limited everything to just traversal? Where we wouldn't even allow Nathan Drake to jump and climb. And this resulted in the Peaceful Village sequence. Uncharted 2, which was really warmly received by critics and fans alike. Because it kind of reset the emotional intensity about halfway through the game, brought everything back down, created the space of reflection. Really importantly, it allowed the player to form an emotional connection with this peaceful village high in the Himalayas, which would then come under attack from Lazarevich's mercenaries a little bit later on in the game, who you, Drake, had kind of drawn to the village because they're chasing you. It worked really well. And Naughty Dog, with all of we now call these experiential sequences where we focus away from gamey gameplay and more on sort of exploration and narrative moments, many of which are interactive. The Peaceful Village did have a bunch of interactive moments scattered through it. And I think it really works. It's all about the contrast. So one of the key things that I brought from Naughty Dog to the USC Games program was a tool called the Game Design Macro. And this is a lightweight, slimmed down game design document that was conceptualized by Mark Cerny and the people that he was collaborating with at Naughty Dog and Insomniac and other places, which helps us plan out the moment-to-moment beats of the game. It's in a spreadsheet rather than a great big Word document. And, it had caught on thanks to a talk that Mark gave nearly 20 years ago now, various places in the industry, but it really wasn't very widely known and it wasn't documented anywhere. So it was my honor to be able to take Mark's ideas and put them into a couple of chapters of my book. And if you, dear listener, are a game designer who struggles to bring the scope of your projects under control, please check my book out of the library or something and have a look at the game design macro chapters, because it's where everything that we've been talking about, Dorian, comes together. The planning of the strands of gameplay and story and how they interrelate with each other, and these patterns of kind of loud, quiet, loud in gameplay and in story, and how they match and line up and either augment each other or cancel each other out. It all kinds of comes to a head in the game design macro.
Yeah, and speaking about sort of loud, quiet, loud, or sort of good, bad, good, it reminds me of the sandwich method you also mentioned in your book. And one segment I found quite interesting. Also, I think this question is interesting to me, at least. It's providing feedback. So even though you said in the book you should never criticize the person and always the work, to me, I think one thing is very common throughout the podcasts I did over the time. The work that people do is so personal sometimes. I think just Alex Nioneki recently told on the podcast that her work was so personal to herself, maybe sometimes even too personal. So when you provide feedback, like I said, you said you should always criticize the work and never the person. But I think it's kind of difficult because there's so much put like about oneself inside these like pieces of code or like these design methodologies. So like, how do you balance that? And since you don't want to discourage people, but you also want to provide like the honest truth about their work. So like, where do you draw the line and how do you tackle this topic?
Well, the sandwiching that you mentioned, I think, is really the key because, this method of giving feedback is quite famous. It's like, the first piece of bread in the sandwich is a compliment that you pay to someone. When you're going to give someone some constructive criticism of something they've made, it's best, especially if you don't know them very well, to start out by telling them something that you like about their work. And you can't just be buttering them up. People are very sensitive, right, to being manipulative or, having hot air blown up them. And it has to be something that you genuinely appreciate. And I think for most creative people, it's not that hard to find something that you're genuinely into in any piece of creative work, especially if you think for a moment. And what this does, it shows respect to the person who made the thing that you're going to critique. It shows them that you see them in their ability and what they can do. And it starts to build a bond of trust so that they see that you respect them, and then they're likely to be a little more receptive to something constructively critical that you have to tell them. And that's the filling of the sandwich, right? Is the constructive criticism that you have to offer them. And I think we always have to make sure that our criticism is constructive. It's not enough to say, oh, that's just crap.
Right.
First of all, you have to be clearer about what is wrong with it than just saying that it's bad. And it has to be clear that you're offering this critique so that it can be made better. And then the second slice of bread in the sandwich, unless it's an open-faced sandwich, is, telling them something else that you like about the work, which kind of seals the deal. It reminds them that you respect them. It cements those emerging bonds of trust. I always say with my students that the more you work with someone, the more you develop those bonds of respect and trust. The bread in your sandwiches can get thinner and thinner and thinner, until eventually it can disappear altogether. Because with my closest collaborators, we don't really need the compliment bread in the sandwich. We can just tell each other clearly what our constructive critique is. And this is the way that we make great work, working together, sharing our opinions in this way, and, figuring out what's landing with our audience of players, what isn't working, emphasizing the former, fixing or getting rid of the latter. But thanks for tuning into that, Dorian. Yeah, that's something I care about a lot.
Yeah, okay. And before we move over to the last segment of the podcast, I have one final food-related question. So, besides a sort of lack of Walker's crisps and sort of like Monster Munch, so what are like the quintessential food-related differences that you're missing about like living in the US these days?
Well, I'm about to travel back to the UK in a couple of weeks to spend some of my summer over there to see my family and, of course, all my friends. And I always do make a beeline for the local newsagents. Happily, in North America, you can get access to British comfort food much more easily than you used to. But I did have to bring back a bottle of HP sauce from the UK, which is a kind of barbecue sauce, sometimes known as brown sauce by British people, that I really like. The thing I'm hankering for right now is I'm very fond of the flavor of elderflower. And that's really hard to get over here. You can actually get some elderflower syrup in IKEA in California.
Oh, wow.
But I'm very fond of elderflower. I'm also very fond of rhubarb. I'm looking forward to some good rhubarb crumbles when I'm over in the UK this summer.
That's perfect, yeah. And for the last segment, we do have a topic, or we do have a segment sometimes called Lessons Learned. And I will just mention a name to you, and then maybe you can tell me something that they taught you during your time when you interacted with them. So, let's start with Mike Brunton.
Oh, so Mike Brunton was a key mentor for me at the very beginning of my career. Sadly, Mike died a few years ago at too young of an age. He was taken from us far too early. And my heart goes out to his family and his dear friends. Mike had got his start in the paper gaming world, actually, the tabletop role-playing world. He worked for Games Workshop for a long time, wrote a lot of source materials, I think some for D&D and for like Warhammer and stuff like that, and became a digital game designer, was tremendously talented. I worked with him at Microprose, where he designed games like B-52 and a bunch of other great stuff. Mike was a real delight. He was incredibly smart. He was really funny, had a kind of wicked sense of humor. And he was also a really kind, sweet man. You know, I was going through some stuff in my early 20s, when Mike got to know me, and he kind of noticed that and kept tabs on me, would check in with me and was always really supportive. So I remain really grateful to him. He actually was one of the small group of people who made the decision to give me my very first job in the game industry. And something that Mike taught me was actually the importance of learning how to type. This is kind of a silly one because he taught me loads of other excellent things about game design. But Mike said, Richard, you're going to be writing a lot in your time as a game designer. So here, we bought you a copy of Mavis Beacon Teaches Typing, which uses video games to teach you how to touch type. And that's just one little thing that I think about very regularly because, of course, I touch type every single day of my life since then.
Yeah. Sorry for bringing it up.
No, Dorian, no, please. I love to talk about Mike. I'm actually really grateful to you for bringing him up.
Okay. Because I actually did research, but I didn't see that he was.
So he died. Yeah. No. It's. Yeah. No, thanks. I appreciate it, and his family and his closest friends would appreciate it. He was a very special person.
So how about Mark Cerny?
So Mark Cerny is one of my key mentors. I was actually a fan of Mark's long before I ever met him. A game that I was fascinated with growing up was Marble Madness, which was a game that Mark almost built with his bare hands at the beginning of his career. He is a game designer and programmer and producer who rose across the course of his career into very senior roles. He was working for Universal Interactive when he brought Jason Rubin and Andy Gavin, the founders of Naughty Dog, under his wing, and they sort of worked together to create Crash Bandicoot. He's remained in this really important role in the Sony organization, where he works as a consultant, collaborating with teams like Naughty Dog, Insomniac, and others. And he's best known perhaps today as the chief architect of the PlayStation 4 and the PlayStation 5, these incredible game consoles. And I was very lucky that I got to work with Mark a lot while I was working on the Uncharted games. He taught me so much. He taught me a lot of specific things about balancing difficulty in a character action game like Uncharted. But I think the greatest learnings I got from Mark were around a thing called method, which is the process of game development used by studios like Naughty Dog and Insomniac, which Mark and his collaborator, Michael M.J. John, kind of formalized in a number of talks and writings, where they stress the importance of pre-production as a phase that you really need to nail before you're ready to move into full production, where they talk about things like a vertical slice, and which they call a publishable first playable, a kind of strong demo of your game that really shows what you're making, and this concept of the game design macro. And so a huge part of the DNA of my book is Mark's work and the work of all these folks associated with him. And I'm really grateful to him for that. I'm happy that I'm able to pass these ideas on now in my teaching.
That's awesome, yeah. And maybe, last but not least, the double pack of Neil Druckmann and Amy Hennig at Naughty Dog to close off the show with a nice Naughty Dog.
And I kind of want to add, a third and fourth person, because there's Bruce Straley and Evan Wells.
Right.
But I kind of don't want to stop there, because there's so many other people at Naughty Dog, who are part of this incredible game-making cabal. I mean, from these folks, I think I learned that it is possible to integrate gameplay and story in new ways that create the kinds of rich, interactive, participatory experiences that I have been dreaming of since I was a little kid, since I was like 8 years old, and I had my first understanding of cyberspace from an episode of Doctor Who, where he goes into this thing ironically called the Matrix, which is like the Time Lord's simulation where they hold all their history and memories and culture. And I began to understand that maybe we could be transported to other spaces where we could kind of step into a story and take a role in the way that the story unfolds. And each one of those folks taught me something different, about how to do this well. Amy got me thinking about story structure, and she also challenged me around just about every different aspect of my game design practice, from systems design to level layout to script writing and set design, lighting design, all of this kind of stuff. Bruce has a really amazing talk that I've heard a few times where he takes lessons from ICO and shows us the ways in which, if we establish patterns of interactivity between elements of the game that the player interacts with, like, holding the girl's hand in ICO. And then if we break those patterns at key moments in the story, subvert them or switch them around, we can create these really powerful emotional moments. And I think Neil's done a great job of using those ideas as well in the Last of Us games. This is the really magical stuff can happen. And I owe a lot to Evan Wells, who was actually just an intern at Crystal Dynamics when I first came to the United States. And of course, his career went from strength to strength, and now he's one of the co-presidents at Naughty Dog. From Evan, I learned that I think if you quieten yourself down and just get methodical about your game development practice, try and balance the emotion involved with clear rationality, that you can invent better kinds of game development process to allow you to make whatever you want to make as an artist. And I'm really grateful to these folks, to everyone I ever worked with and who I continue to work with. I could list out so many folks at USC that I've continued to learn from. And I've always thought that there's this kind of close relationship between learning and games. This is widely accepted, right, in the world now, that games are potentially, at least, amazing teaching tools, because what we are always doing as game players is learning new things and then applying them.
Right.
I'm a little sad, Dorian, that we have run out of time to talk extensively about my latest game obsession, which is Elden Ring. Actually, my twin gaming obsessions of Elden Ring and Unpacking, because have you played Unpacking?
Yes, I love that game. Also from a narrative standpoint, incredible.
Really wonderful from a narrative standpoint, you're right, yeah. And I actually see some structural similarities between these two very dissimilar games. But yeah, in this sense of we're always, video game players are like little scientists, right? Entering a world, forming hypotheses based on their observations, conducting experiments to figure out how things actually work inside of the game. And so to be now a professor of game design, to be teaching this incredibly rich field, just is giving me great joy in this phase of my life. And I feel very lucky.
That's awesome, Richard. And I think, you just mentioned it, we've run out of time. And as you can likely hear from the conversation, we could have talked for, I guess, another couple of hours talking about your book, your lessons learned, or, whatever, or the eating habits of the UK. We can, it could be about anything at all. But you're always welcome back to the show. If you have another gaming obsession to talk about, or if you want to plug another couple of books or authors, I will most likely check out a couple of those. Well, thank you so much for coming to the show.
Dorian, it's been a real pleasure. I'm a fan of you, me, in the industry and of yours. So it's a delight to talk to you today. Thank you so much for having me on. And I'll take you up on that. I'm going to start up some new projects this summer. So and maybe I can come back and talk about them.
That's awesome. Yeah, like I said, you're always back. You're always welcome back here. And before we close off the show, is there anything you want to plug? Where can people find you? Besides, I will always link the guests, the Twitter and the socials into this into the show notes. But, if you want to plug it anyway, just tell the people where can find you.
Well, of course, while self-promotion doesn't come hugely easily to me, I do want to plug my book, A Playful Production Process, for game designers and everyone. I actually hope that my book is going to be useful to people working outside strictly of games, but kind of in adjacent spaces, whether you're an escape room designer or an artist making interactive artwork. I hope that my book might be useful to you. You can find it at playfulproductionprocess.com. Please let me know online what you can think of it. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at rich_lem.
That's awesome. Yeah. And if you like the show, tell a friend. And if you had any, some design lessons taken away from this show, please let me know also. You can find me on Twitter at Dorian Chow, and also the podcast at Yumi Industry. And we're also on Instagram and on Twitter, where I sometimes, post bad drawings or like sometimes, reviews of the latest pokey trend of eating snacks from Japan.
Maybe we can have a bad drawing off battle this summer on social media, Dorian. I'd like that.
Awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, I think I've already seen a couple of your drawings, and you're already way ahead of me. But I will send you a couple of drawings. You can find them on Instagram, and then you will let me know what you think of them.
That sounds great.
And thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. If you like the show, tell a friend, and listen to you, hear you, see you, I guess, in the next episode. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Have a wonderful summer.